Hello and welcome back to Live from Our Living Room. I'm joined today by Kevin Miller, Associate Director for Higher Education in the Bipartisan Policy Center's Economic Policy Project, to discuss President Biden's student loan forgiveness plan announced on August 24th. We're recording this on the 25th, so it was yesterday, very timely. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
So before we dive into the specifics of the plan and discuss some of the criticism that the president's announcement generated, let's take a look at the big picture. How do student loan programs work, and how much money in total is owed to federal loan agencies?
Sure. So the federal student loan system is actually pretty complicated. There's multiple types of loans. They can be applied to attendance at essentially any college or university in the US as long as they're eligible, which is the vast majority of them. And so again, it's actually pretty complex. So that essentially if you go to college, as long as you don't have an existing default on a previous student loan from the federal government, you can almost always get student loans to go to college.
And can you remind us how much money in total is owed to these federal agencies?
Sure. So the total, so per borrower is probably a better place to start actually. So the range of how much borrowers take out is actually really large. So if you only go to, say, community college for a few semesters, you might have even under $1,000 as a student loan. That's possible. The typical amount for a bachelor's degree graduate is about $30,000 at this point. And if you get a master's degree, especially if you pay for it yourself, including through debt, you can take out over $100,000 for a master's degree sometimes. And so there's a big variance per borrower. Total right now, the federal government holds about $1.6 trillion in student loans for around 40 to 45 million borrowers.
You mentioned how complicated this system is, and I gathered that during the course of my research. There are acronyms here that have letters that seem completely out of place. But what I gathered is that this will only apply to federally held student debt. What are the other requirements for loan forgiveness, and how much debt is being forgiven per student according to President Biden's plan?
So what you mentioned again is that it's only federally held loans that apply. So there are private student loans, and there are some old federally guaranteed loans that are privately held from years ago that may not be affected either. Though it's useful to point out that for people who hold private or what are called FFEL loans from long ago that are federally guaranteed, those people would have the option to consolidate their loans into a new federally held loan. So actually, those people could potentially access this as well. But that's essentially the only requirement at this point, that and an income cap. So what the Biden administration chose to do was say that if you make over $125,000 or $250,000 for a household, then you're not eligible for this forgiveness. But the loan being federally held and the income cap are essentially the only requirements. So almost everyone, again, with the exception of the folks above that income cutoff, which are actually a pretty small proportion of loan holders at this point, almost everyone will be at least hypothetically eligible. And what the amount proposed has been was about $10,000 for everyone. So if you had a smaller loan balance than that, so say you had a $5,000 balance, you would get about $5,000 of relief. You wouldn't get a refund, say if you'd already paid off debt in the past. There's also a thing that the administration chose to do where they announced an extra $10,000 of relief for people who received need-based Pell Grants when they were enrolled in college. The Pell Grants are an undergrad-only grant. So when they were in undergrad, they had demonstrated financial need, they received a Pell Grant. Those people will be potentially eligible for up to another $10,000 of debt. So that's going to cover probably at least a third of borrowers will have under that amount in outstanding loans. So just at the $10,000 level, we're expecting maybe about a third, so around maybe somewhere in the 12 to 15 million range, will actually have their loans completely wiped out if this is implemented as planned. The additional 10,000 for Pell Grant recipients we'll take that up a little bit higher. I've heard as many as 20 million people might have a balance of zero after this.
That's remarkable. I mean, $10,000 is sort of a drop in the bucket compared to the total price of a higher education. So that so many people have their entire debt balance wiped out points to how substantial this number really is. Student loans became a political focal point, especially among Democrats, in large part following the COVID era loan repayment moratorium instituted by President Trump. That moratorium has continued after more than 2 years. Has President Biden indicated when loan repayments might restart?
Yeah, and this is a really important point for a number of reasons. So one of the things he announced yesterday, along with the 10,000 slash extra 10,000 for Pell Grant recipients, was that he intends to restart repayment for all borrowers on January 1st of 2023. So what's happened, unfortunately, is that after the initial pause and during the Trump administration, the Biden administration has actually extended that pause a few times at this point. And so there's some uncertainty around when that's actually going to happen. I think at this point, with the forgiveness especially, it's become really critical that repayment actually restart. So there's some sense of returning to normal, but also at this point, there hasn't been any money coming into the federal student loan program for 2 years. No one's been making payments on their debt, even though new loans are being made. So in terms of the Department of Education and the federal government's balance sheet, that is turning out to be really costly at this point. So payments need to restart. The other thing that is a big factor in terms of why repayment actually needs to restart is that at this point, there's broad consensus that the economy is a little overheated, right? So inflation is high at the moment. So when the pause on student loan repayments was initially created, the economy was in a lot of danger, right? That was early during the pandemic. Tons of people were out of work. People's wages and rent were really uncertain, but that's no longer the case. The economy is largely recovered and now is a little overheated. So what was a good policy earlier in the pandemic at this point is probably contributing to the overheating of the economy. So restarting repayments will help address that.
And do you expect the president to restart repayments at the next deadline of December 31st?
Personally, my guess would be yes. I think that this forgiveness announcement has put him in a position where he can say, look, I addressed some of these problems with the student loan system. I provided assistance to people who really needed it. Now we need repayment to restart. So my guess would be yes, but of course it's been extended before, so we can't say that with certainty.
We've heard a number of criticisms of the policy. You mentioned one, which is that it might exacerbate inflation. There are others. Some people believe that it's unfair that debtors who manage to pay off their obligations won't be rewarded. Others worry that the policy disproportionately favors the well-to-do, and still others wonder if it's even legal. But I want to talk about one concern in particular: the idea that providing loan forgiveness, by doing so, it incentivizes higher education institutions to continue raising prices, the moral hazard argument. What do you make of that?
Yeah, and I think this topic brings up a broader topic in higher ed policy and finance, which is the price of college generally being too high, right? And so one of the critiques of the student loan system, even before forgiveness like this was proposed, one of those critiques has always been, you have federal grants, you have federal loans, you have other sources of aid. All these sources of aid give institutions, colleges, universities, no incentive to keep the price of college down. And so, I think that's probably at least partially true. There's something called the Bennett hypothesis, which is this hypothesis that if aid increases to it, the price will increase. The evidence on that in reality, if you look at times when aid has increased, the evidence is mixed. Some people are very firm believers that it's true. Any increase in aid will increase tuition. So those people today, I'm sure, are pointing to this forgiveness and saying, yes, absolutely, this is going to make people increase prices for college. I'm less convinced. I think at this point, we've actually seen in the data in the past 5 to 10 years that a lot of college students and prospective students have become very shy of the price of college and worried about debt and affordability. And so I don't think this one-time $10,000 forgiveness is going to reverse that trend. I think, honestly, that the current generation of students and prospective students, again, is really wary at this point about the price of college. So I think a lot of policymakers and advocates have been worried about that and working on that. One thing that is, again, people have been working on and we need to continue is better transparency. So making sure that prospective students know what their financial aid offer really means, how much of it is in grants, how much of it is in loans, making sure they understand if you take out $10,000 of loans every year that you're in college, you're going to owe something like $40,000 or $50,000 when you get out of college. And that's going to cost you, X $100 per month to repay. And so a lot of this isn't clear to all students, either just because colleges aren't taking the time to explain it well. And in some cases, of course, there are bad actor colleges out there who are acting in a predatory way, and they deliberately obscure this from their students. So transparency is one big thing. But again, when we talk about things like the public colleges and universities that enroll most students, state governments, the federal government, and the colleges and institutions themselves also need to be thinking about how do we keep prices down? How do we make college affordable, especially for low-income students who might otherwise have to depend on debt? And so, again, this is something that isn't a new problem, but the forgiveness decision really brings it into sharp relief.
Well, then, while we've got you here, are there steps that policymakers can take to drive down the cost of higher education? Or is it simply this function of supply and demand that you described, that as the price of higher education grows, students become less interested in taking on loans, and that tends to drive down the price? Or, what can policymakers do here?
Well, I think, while I'm talking to someone who talks to other folks at BPC all the time, it's worth pointing out that a lot of what's going on with the cost of attending college is just the cost of living. So housing costs are a big factor in the cost of going to college. Students have to live somewhere. So this isn't just a higher ed issue, it's also a broader economic issue. The cost of living is part of what's driving up the price of college. In tuition and fees specifically, I think there have been a lot of proposals about what we should do on trying to keep down the cost of college. One thing that the higher ed team at BPC has proposed is creating a federal flexible block grant program to states. So infusing federal money to states with a state match, so requiring them to increase their own spending and directing that money to affordability. So what that might look like is bringing down the price of tuition at state institutions. It might also look like increasing state grant programs or funding college promise programs, which cover the cost of college for some students. So what we think there is that keeping that flexible, allowing states to decide how they want to bring down the cost of college in their own state, would broaden support for such a move. And so again, what we're really thinking there is, how do we just bring down the cost of college on the front end, right? Make it so that fewer students need loans, or they need smaller loans to go to college.
Well, Kevin, whether you're a supporter or a critic of President Biden's proposal, this will clearly have a pretty profound impact on the way that students go about pursuing higher education for years to come. So really appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks again.